A violinist explores the letters of the Gilman Ordway manuscript collection at the Schubert Club Music Museum, St. Paul, Minnesota. Presented by Peter Sheppard Skærved. This podcast is part of the series Knowledge Exchange Violin, and it is supported by Knowledge Exchange, part of Research England. Friendship, collaboration, and travel. Richard Strauss, Ernest Bloch, Edward Elgar, Eugène Ysaÿe, and Lawrence of Arabia. Now I know that I'm not the only one to feel my music. That was the young voice of the great composer Ernest Bloch. For me, as a musician, this is a record of a moment I understand, perhaps of a moment we all long for, when we realize that we are not alone in the world, that our attempts to communicate in our way have been understood. Perhaps even more than that, it records a moment of generosity from one artist at the end of their career to another at the start of theirs. For me, as a violinist, as an artist, it brings a tear of gratitude and memory to my eye, remembering similar moments in my creative life and the struggles which preceded them. The Schubert Club Music Museum is housed in the historic Landmark Center in the center of St. Paul, Minnesota. This is a small museum and perfectly formed. It brings together a globally significant collection of keyboard instruments alongside a renowned concert series which brings the great living performers to St. Paul and an extraordinary collection of letters, the Gilman Ordway manuscript collection, to and from musicians. This is the first of a series of podcasts introducing some of these extraordinary letters. I'd like to talk about why and how they interest me. When I first sat down with the collection and started to read, there was a shock of recognition as a musician. The voices that spring from the pages talked of things I recognize. For whatever the posthumous fame of these great artists and musicians, here they wrote about the challenges they faced, the value of their friends, family, lovers and colleagues, fellow travelers all. The tenor of the letters ranges from the practicalities of their lives on the road, facing the pressures of performing, of collaboration, through to their inspirations, which so often they find in their colleagues. I find that the voices reaching out from the page offer me inspiration and solace. Alongside all of this, there's the overriding joy that we have the music. It's a lasting testament, if you like, that all the struggle was worth it. Let me introduce some of these voices to you, beginning with a charming miniature written by a great composer at the end of his creative life, Richard Strauss's Daphne Etude. The Bavarian composer Richard Strauss is quite rightly associated with intensely dramatic, orchestral and operatic works. His outrageously ambitious music tilts at heaven and projects his own hero's life into the world of myth, literature and nature. He succeeded against all the odds to summon up musical counterparts to Cervantes' Don Quixote, Nietzsche, Also sprach Zarathustra, to Don Juan, to Electra, to Salome, and even to the Alps, which rose over his home, the Alpine Symphony. But Strauss was a musician amongst other musicians who valued and appreciated the work of his colleagues. In the summer of 1941, he wrote a letter from his home at the foot of the mountains in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. He had built the house 3 decades earlier, initially as a summer retreat, but it had become the family home. Strauss noted, "My profound sorrow at the untimely passing of my beloved, dear friend Gaubert, the great artist and excellent conductor. Please do extend my warm and deep sympathy to the widow of the deceased and to my friend Rouche at this irreparable loss for the opera and for French art." Richard Strauss had little in common with Gaubert as a composer, but this simplest of personal notes shows his sadness that a great musician, 15 years younger than he, was gone. It's a touching bouquet. The music you just heard was written 4 years later for Strauss's grandson Christian. Christian was studying the violin, and his grandfather wanted to give him something to play, a charming musical birthday card. So he arranged the melody from his 1937 opera Daphne. I suspect that the reason the melody was in his mind was that the opera's dedicatee and the conductor of its first performance, Karl Böhm, had just completed his first recording in Vienna. Christian's birthday piece, Daphne Etude, is an almost nothing, a petit rien, the complete opposite of his grandfather's monster orchestral works. The piece never leaves G major, and it ends with a simple challenge for the boy, a long-held dying away, a diminuendo, on the open G string, the bottom string of the violin. For all of its simplicity, it is beautiful, and I love to play it. Christian Strauss was Jewish. His grandmother, Paula Neumann, was sent to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where she died. He became a celebrated doctor, head of gynecology and obstetrics at the Garmisch-Partenkirchen Hospital. He lived in his grandfather's house, where our letter and this piece were written, until he died just 2 years ago in 2020. One composer who loved Strauss's Alpine home was the British composer Edward Elgar. He and his wife Alice visited Garmisch-Partenkirchen 4 times for holidays in the 1890s, enraptured by the folk culture, the beauty of the landscape, and the churches. Even at the end of his life, Elgar could be quite starstruck, as 2 letters here in the Gilman Ordway collection show. They're written to one A.C. Shaw. Shaw was a soldier, a diplomat, a writer, an archaeologist, and quite possibly a spy, stationed at Plymouth, where he worked on high-speed boats for the Royal Air Force. From Sir Edward Elgar, Master of the King's Music, Marlbank, Rainbow Hill, Worcester, 29th of September 1932. Dear A.C. Shaw, please forgive me if I've not saluted you correctly. The address on the envelope was given me by Mrs. GPS, so I feel safe over that. It was a very great pleasure to have you here, nearly a month ago, and to know that you were a listener to my music. I've read about you with something akin to awe, and never had the smallest hope of seeing you here. I am only writing to say what satisfaction it gives me to know that the Second Symphony has a friend in you. Elgar's correspondent was just as much of a celebrity as he. A.C. Shaw, Aircraftsman Shaw, was the name under which T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, was registered in the Royal Air Force, for whom he was now working. Lawrence had visited Elgar at his Worcester house, Marlbank. It was clear that during the visit they discussed Elgar's great 1911 Second Symphony. This piece had had a revival of interest a few years earlier, resulting from the composer's recording for HMV, his master's voice, made in 1928, with the composer conducting. Elgar was clearly delighted to find that Lawrence loved the piece. A few months later, Lawrence wrote back from his Dorset cottage, Clouds Hill. "We've just been playing your second symphony. 3 of us, a sailor, a tank corps soldier, and myself. So there are all 3 of the services present, and we agreed that you must be written to and told, if you're well enough to be bothered, that this symphony gets further under our skins than anything else in the record library at Clouds Hill. We have the violin concerto too, so that says quite a lot. Generally, we play the symphony last of all, towards the middle of the night, because nothing comes off very well after it. One seems to stop there." Lawrence pointed out that his home was rather less palatial than Elgar's Worcester villa. "He would laugh at my cottage, which has 1 room upstairs, gramophone and records, and 1 room downstairs, books. But there is also a bath, and we sleep anywhere we feel inclined. So it suits me. A one-man house, I think." But then Lawrence got to the point of his letter. After the death of Elgar's wife, Alice, in 1920, he, bereft, stopped composing. However, in the last few years of his life, Elgar was working on a 3rd symphony. This idea was encouraged by his friend George Bernard Shaw. Clearly, he talked with T. Lawrence about the project. Lawrence continued his letter. "There is a selfish side to our concern. We want your Symphony 3. If it is wiser and wider and deeper than 2, we shall very sadly dethrone our present friend and play it last of the evening. Until it comes, we shall always stand in doubt if the best has really yet happened." On the 28th of December 1933, Elgar replied, "My dear T.E. Shaw, by now, his health had deteriorated considerably and he was in care, so the letter is marked dictated. On the stationery, Marlbank has been crossed out and replaced with nursing home." Clearly Elgar was eager to leave, and the idea of Lawrence's home had heightened this wanderlust, even if he was unsure of the amenities of the little cottage Clouds Hill. "Your description of Clouds Hill makes me long to share your cottage, even though you appear to sleep outside." By this stage, Elgar had completed about 130 pages of the projected symphony. He wrote, "I am glad that the 2nd symphony wears so well with you and your friends, but mark you, the 3rd, if I am ever well enough to finish it, will make it look small. Perhaps so, perhaps not." It was clear that the new work, if and when it was finished, would, in Elgar's mind, dwarf the hour-long number 2. But this was not to be. In February 1934, he died in the Worcester nursing home. 1 year later, Lawrence was killed riding his rough Superior motorbike not far from Clouds Hill. He was swerving, trying to avoid 2 boys on bicycles. Lawrence was just 46 years old. For English people like me, Elgar and Lawrence were in the air from childhood. They represented ideals of artistry, of adventure, of scholarship, and their music and stories were constantly around me. But they also represented something lost, as the British Empire, which they'd come to signify in all of its evil and sometimes a little good, had slipped from the maps in the schoolrooms. My parents, Susan and Tony, live in a little cottage in the forest which reaches into East London from Epping to Leytonstone. If you walk out of their front door into the oak and beech woods towards Chingford Plain, where King Henry VIII built himself a hunting lodge, which is still there, you come to a rampart in the forest, looking out over London, Pole Hill. This was a piece of land which Lawrence owned. He built a holiday house there and a swimming pool. When he died, it was left to the people of London and became part of the public Epping Forest. There's a plaque there commemorating his gift. I sometimes walk there from my parents' house and sit and imagine him listening to his 78 of Elgar's music, most likely reading and smoking. Perhaps the most important thing for any musician of any age is to be encouraged. Art is a lonely pursuit, and innovation particularly so. So we need to know that we're not alone, that the path we've chosen is not a futile one. One treasure here in the Gilman-Ordway manuscript collection is a letter from the young Swiss composer Ernest Bloch. This documents an evening that he spent with his former violin teacher, the greatest of all Belgian violinist composers, Eugène Ysaÿe. Bloch had studied with him in 1897. Ysaÿe was the most natural of violinists and a brilliant composer. However, he always suffered terribly with performance nerves. Once, after performing Elgar's violin concerto in Belgium, soon after its 1910 London premiere by Fritz Kreisler, he spotted the young fellow violinist, the Hungarian Karl Flesch. He went up and whispered to him, "Oh, if only I had the tranquility of your bowing on." One letter in the collection here documents Ysaÿe's struggles with nerves. These eventually stopped him from performing in the late 1920s, exacerbated by his diabetes. The letter was written from Lodz in Poland in January 1925 to his American second wife, Jeanette Dinsen, 44 years younger than he. Yesterday evening was not good. I played badly, without creating, as if indifferent, with mediocre physical technical means and a capricious and unstable bow. Having 1.5 days of rest, I hope to find myself back to normal tomorrow in Krakow. Unlike his former violin teacher, Ernest Bloch chose to make the leap from being a violinist composer to applying himself to composition full-time. His letter notes how long this decision took him. He had been vacillating for 5 years. It's one of the most exciting documents to have in one's hand, for, as the young composer recounts the evening that he spent with his one-time teacher, his excitement spills over and his pen races ahead of his thought, so there are progressively less words per page, and at one point he forgets to complete the sentence on the page he's just turned on the following one. After Ysaÿe had made himself comfortable and lit his pipe, Bloch showed him scores, including his Israel Symphony. Here are his words. Ysaÿe, moved, looked at me with wonder and said, "Ah, but I never would have expected this. This is beautiful, grand, forceful. It has immense power." He pressed my hand, and all the signs of admiration he gave me compensated me largely for the troubles and irritations so long suffered in silence. Finally, after the last movement, Ysaÿe thanked me warmly. "This is a beautiful work of an artist and a poet. You are establishing yourself with it. If you're now writing so well, what would it be in 10 years? Bloch was overwhelmed. His handwriting got larger and larger, almost spooling off the page. Now I know that I'm not the only one to feel my music, since Ysaÿe has positively vibrated with it. He does not talk to me about craft, of technique, which he finds perfect, but of the poetry, of the colour, of the warmth, of all the joys, pains, hopes, passion that I put into my work, and he was emotionally moved by them. I have fulfilled my purpose. I have said what I wanted to say. There is the essence. There is the compensation for my labour." Bloch's wonderful letter documents a moment of supreme generosity, of a passing of the flame. The teacher, Ysaÿe, assures his timorous, exhausted, worried pupil, Bloch, that the new path he has taken is the right one. Ysaÿe says, music is inside you. And Bloch's letter, like the music of these extraordinary artists, these giants, it can do that for us, give us the strength to carry on, So faith in our endeavours. Block finishes. Now to work. And if my life does not have ordinary human luck, you will have something purer, more exalted. Art. This podcast was recorded in the recital room of the Schubert Club Music Museum, St. Paul, Minnesota. It was made with the assistance of Kate Cooper, the Education and Museum Director, of Barry Kempton, the Artistic and Executive Director of the Schubert Club. The engineer was Max Carlson. The podcast forms part of Peter Sheppard Skærved's 2022 Knowledge Exchange Violin Project, which is supported by Research England and made in partnership with the Royal Academy of Music, London.